I recently shared a video about the movie coming out called Aztec Batman Clash of Empires. And while the original video itself didn't get too many views, the shorts I cut from it did. And on the final short, entitled How Aztec Batman is a Morality Inversion, some of my viewers had some really good questions and comments referring to something that I'd rather address in a larger video. So since this is a response to viewers' video, I don't plan for this to be as edited. In fact, I don't even have a script for this. I'm literally speaking off the cuff, with all my pauses just edited out in post. So let's get into it. For most of my life, I've noticed this very strange sentiment that anytime you bring up anything to do with colonialism or anything to do with Great Britain or Spain or the Catholic Church in the Middle Ages, there is this strange, almost impulsive revulsion to the idea that many European countries spent time conquering and settling, colonizing other places on the planet. And the moment someone like me or another person that people would deem conservative decides to say something positive about that, it would immediately be jumped on and considered either racist or lacking empathy or not being respectful of other cultures. And I apologize if you hear my kid in the background. That's my kid in the background. Now for context, as I said, this was about Aztec Batman. I'll actually link my original video in the description. But the TLDR is there's a new Batman movie coming out that is done from the perspective of the Aztecs, but they take a lot of liberties with the reference source. Like for instance, for whatever reason, their Aztecs don't do child sacrifice and assume not slavery either, which is really strange to me because that's one of the things that Aztecs were very well known for. They're very brutal, not only to their children, but also to tribes around them. And as a result, they ended up making this Aztec version of Batman who is a superhero who fights against the Spanish, who in their version of history is the bad guy. In my opinion, it's a prime example of recontextualization where you take something that was a historical event and either in fiction or non-fiction, you change it around. So it's a reimagining of what happened. Or in the case of some people, so that it's the true story of what happened. But let's get into the comments. That is the complicated thing about real events, right? It's harder to say who is really the good guy and bad guy, unless it's 100% one way or the other. Sure, the Aztecs were a tribe who were essentially wiped out, but they wiped out numerous tribes to the point they were almost one of the only ones left there. And what this viewer, I Am Bear Tank, says here is actually true. In history, there are very rarely 100% good guys or 100% bad guys. Normally, it's some kind of mixture of the two. But for the sake of simplicity, I and others will often label either people or cultures as the good guys or bad guys, understanding the underlying nuances, but using generalizations just to get our point across. And I think it's in that generalization that a lot of people fail to understand what's actually being said. And I replied, yes, I personally think most conflict across history is a wash, unless one side or the other is especially vile. In this case, I think the Aztecs were the vile ones for sure. So if I were to have a scale here, and I would have the Aztecs on one side and the Spaniards on the other, yes, the Spaniards were absolutely brutal at the time, especially when it came to the religious sect and the Inquisition. They were known for being extremely brutal, enforcing hundreds of thousands of conversions across many sects of dissidents and other religious beliefs, using torture, coercion, I assume blackmail, and other methods. And when it came to conquest, they were no nicer. However, if I were to compare them to the Aztecs, who also were known for their conquest, and were known for child sacrifice, slavery, ripping the steel, beating hearts out of their victims, I'm going to pick the Spaniards. And it's not because I have this rosy idea of who the Spaniards were. It's because in my opinion, there's a difference between having a society that is ripping people's hearts out and sacrifice to a rain god, it doesn't exist, as opposed to a society that's part of a larger structure in Europe, with a superstructure of the Roman Catholic Church, which is doing its best to keep literally thousands of different groups all together. And as awful as it was, the brutality in the political structure of that Catholic Church at the time is what allowed Europe to be united, is what allowed Europe to even have the technological advances that it did, and prevented Europe from falling into constant, continual infighting, which have destroyed all its potential for advancement, societal advancement, and technology. So if I were to put a simple label on it, I would say, compared to the Aztecs, they were good, especially since we are able to live now in prosperity due to the people back then making those terrible, brutal decisions, which again, yes, I disagree with. So to another comment. Aztec Batman is weird appropriation nonsense. A separate question though. Why do you see bringing light to the truth about how America was brutally colonized by multiple cultures that destroyed the lives of native tribes here as some kind of movement? Also, why is that bad? We weren't taught the full history of our nation intentionally. Our government doesn't want people to have conflicted feelings. They want unquestioned pride and loyalty. Those of us who support truth, and yes, this cartoon is garbage, but you won't be showing children all the blood and gore of history. The truth is what's most important. Ultimately, using Batman in this way is so dumb, but I get what they're going for. The Conquistadors were not better men. They just had the technology to dominate, enslave, rape, and deceive. Okay, so there's multiple things going on here, and some of this I see quite often, and some of it I actually respond to directly to the commenter. And to some extent, he actually makes a good point. Now, I wasn't personally brought up in public school, so whenever people say that, oh, the government doesn't want you to know this, or, oh, schools didn't teach you this, None of that applies to me. I don't care. It doesn't mean anything. I was taught a combination of curriculum from my parents, scrounging things here and there, and ultimately culminated in using a Becca curriculum from my high school years. I wasn't taught some idealized version of America, especially growing up in a black family. They taught me the brutality of the people who came over and colonized the United States. They taught me that a lot of settlers who dealt with the American Indians were oftentimes liars, oftentimes made treaties that they broke, oftentimes did everything they could to be absolute cutthroat to the natives. But they also taught me that not everyone's bad. There was a mix. Just like in many conflicts, there are people who are bad and there's some people who are good. There are people who constantly tried to work with the Indians. There are people who genuinely made treaties and kept them. And in the end, as unfortunate as it is, American Indians got the bad end of that struggle. But not to mention, many of those tribes were also themselves not blameless. Many of them were actually brutal. Many of them fought back against the incoming settlers, seeing them as foreign invaders, either rightly or wrongly. But one thing I definitely learned is that history isn't just a struggle of humans fighting each other, just to dominate each other, just to hold power over each other. It's more than that. Most of what humanity struggles against is not actually other humans, it's actually against nature itself. For the supermajority of human history, in fact, until 150 years ago, everyone had to have some ideas of farming or hunting or gathering. Life expectancy sucked. Diseases rampaged for reasons no one could understand. And as a result, people had to eke out an existence for literally thousands of years, trying to survive either day by day, week by week, or in some chances, if they're lucky, month by month. And until technology came around, everything revolved around manpower and animal power. If you had a stream nearby or a river nearby, that was great. You could use water power, but that was about it. The only real way to escape having to work constantly is either to have really good animals do it for you or to conquer someone else. Trade is messy. You have to have agreements with people. You have to get them to want them to even work with you. You have to have the resource base in order to make the trade viable. You have to have a product that people want. Why go through all those steps and why go through all that trouble when you can just, conquer someone else and make them do the work for you? So in the end, that's how slavery was invented. You need a manpower. There's a modern idea that slavery is all about seeing someone immediately as lesser than you because of the color of their skin. But that's not how it was viewed for all of human history until 5 seconds ago. The reality is that anyone who worked for you or was willing to be conquered was lesser than you. You got conquered. You lost. Sucks. And if they didn't have an excuse for thinking of you lesser than them before they conquered you, they made up one after the fact. But again, the reason for this is because you need land, you need resources, you need stuff built. Just go make the guy next door do it. It's easier. So when it came to medieval Europe, you had the oppressive, overpowering Catholic Church. Yes, I see it primarily as having been a political entity, not just a religious one. But it was necessary to keep all those thousands of, what were they called? Vichys, tribes, I'm not really sure, factions together in Europe and preventing them from just fighting each other constantly and splitting apart. And in my opinion, that's one of the things that separated Europe and Africa. Not only was there a difference in climate and resources, Europe has a temperate climate and is much better for cultivating resources than Africa does, which has better raw resources, but in terms of getting food production and infrastructure, it's more difficult. But in terms of governance, Africa is extremely factional and has been for a long time. One thing that the Catholic Church gave Europe that places like Africa, for instance, never had was the ability to have some overarching superstructure that kept everything together so that there could be advancement. So when I look back and say, hey, the United Kingdom was a force for good, that's what I mean. They were part of that societal structure that for good or bad, were able to actually get progress compared to everyone else around them or compared to times before them. We were able to get to where we are now because people were able to, in essence, rise from the muck and the mire and make micro incremental steps, both morally and technologically, to get to the point where we are now. Yes, many of these civilizations were horrible and used slaves. And later on, those same civilizations abolished slavery, not just because they saw it as a moral bad, a moral evil, but because they also made the technological advancements and societal advancements that slavery was no longer necessary, and in fact, was inefficient. There's a channel I think called Itchy Boots of a woman from the Netherlands, I think it is. She tries to travel every continent across the world using nothing but her motorcycle. I think she's gone across South America and about half of Africa by now. And while, due to an accident, unfortunately, her trip has been postponed, I've seen most of her trip throughout Africa, and it's eye-opening. I recommend you go check out our channel as well. I'll leave a link to her content in the description. But one thing it definitely shows is the difference between our societies and theirs. It's very common for her to be just riding along some long stretch of dirt, muddy road for hours and hours on end, nothing happening, and then all of a sudden you start going across checkpoints. And these checkpoints aren't really anything big deal. It's just a couple kids holding a stick across the mudway. And you have to pay them some kind of money in order to get by. or a couple of guys in some old revolutionary uniform will walk up and give you an inspection. And if you're lucky, you might even find a couple actual official ones set up by the government occasionally, or at least they'll be pretending they're from the government. And sometimes they'll be having guns on their back and guns in their slings, and they'll even point them at you and hold you up and try to take money from you or take more money, extort you, just because they see you're an American. But what is that? Now, as an American, she's able to cross most of these without issue, but these checkpoints are either set up by tribes, families, warring warlords, different governmental factions, because there's constant conflict in these areas. There's constant conflict over resources, there's constant conflict over old grudges and rivalries. And without some kind of super overarching ambition or religion or guidance, these factions will just continue fighting each other in perpetuity until someone just comes down and crams their fist down and says, no more. Now we can look at the guy who crams his fist down and says no more and say they're bad. In some cases, they are. But in a couple of 100 years, 300 years, 400 years, if a society actually sprouts out of that and technology sprouts out of that and everyone stays unified, that's a good thing. So that's what I mean when I say good. If you were to look at Nigeria, for instance, they were a colonized country. I think they were colonized by the United Kingdom. And in the 1900s, they were to get their freedom. They had some time of revolutionary war, but for the most part, they got it together. They got an overarching government structure that keeps everything together. And as a result, guess what? They're able to have one of the best economies in Africa. They're exporting their people to the United States, getting an education from our universities, and taking that information back to their home country and building businesses, building medical advancements, building skyscrapers in cities. And Nigeria is honestly an example of a colonized country that became a success story. Compared to, in my opinion, South Africa does not appear to be a success story because the people there, for whatever reason, remain very factional even despite the colonial influence. And unfortunately, it seems instead of rising up like Nigeria has, South Africa seems to have been going through a turbulent period, and slowly I don't know that their government or their country is going to continue being solid in the near future. But the jury's out on that one. But across the country, there are numerous examples of failed states that used to be colonized, but the moment the colonizers left, they descended right back into factional violence because there's nothing keeping them together. The only force that was keeping them together before were the United Kingdom or France or Spain or whoever colonized them previously, and the moment they pull out, they go back to what they were doing before. So he says here, the conquistadors are not better men. They just had technology to dominate, enslave, and deceive. In some ways, that's true. However, in other ways, it's not. In my opinion, for most of human history, if you're capable of conquering another country for the reasons that I detailed earlier, resources, manpower, land, if you could conquer another country, you would do so. If you had the ability, you would do it. The reason the Aztecs didn't conquer the Spaniards is because they didn't have the ability to do so. That's it. It just so happens that the Spaniards are better at it. So I don't see that as a good or bad or anything. I don't care. They just didn't have the means. Yeah, good, I guess. But I don't see the conquistadors as better men because they're capable of dominating. I see them as better because they're a part of society that raised all of humanity out of the muck and the mire. As opposed to the Aztecs, who are brutal, advantageous, and honestly, they probably would have been eventually deposed by the surrounding tribes. In fact, I read somewhere that 60 to 70% of the people who fought against the Aztecs were actually the surrounding tribes who got together with the conquistadors and overthrew them. That likely would have happened eventually anyway. And the last comment chain comes from David the Frank, who starts with, when Darkseid comes to conquer Earth, enslave its people, erase its culture, and exterminate the powerless, who are you going to side with? The colonizer or the colonized? Well, based on how I've already explained, you probably already understand, I don't have this colonizer-colonized mindset. I don't immediately see the colonizer as bad and the colonized as the weak people needing to be defended. So this line of questioning doesn't mean anything to me. In fact, I wrote back, I am extremely pro-humanity. So you could put anything on the other side of the equation, from space wars to interplanetary utopian philanthropists. They're against humans, I'm against them. Doesn't really apply here. And personally, I think this colonizer versus the colonized idea comes from, if you're familiar with moral foundations theory, it comes from people who have an overly sensitive predisposition towards fairness. They see something that is unfair, and because nothing else is balancing that out, they zoom in far too closely on the unfairness aspect of it and miss everything else that becomes relevant. And I don't think this is necessarily bad, it's merely a psychological or philosophical or even political predisposition. But I do think that unchecked across society, if too many people have this, would that be myopia, hyperopia, nearsighted predisposition towards fairness, then you could run into a lot of problems. Hence where we are right now. He replied, you laugh as if I said something obvious, but you quite literally suggest in your video that it's permissible to invade and conquer any people you happen to meet, even those who pose no threat to your nation, simply because you deem their culture as lesser than yours. How would you convince an alien species with technology far beyond ours, that our culture, our society is worthy of existing. The only consistent moral principle is to condemn colonization of sentient people. And then I copy-paste my response from earlier, which is kind of a boiled-down representation of what I've already said, but you can read it here. He replied by saying, "After reading both of these posts, I think you truly believe that Catholic people are superior to all others, calling African and indigenous peoples barbaric repeatedly, despite them being the ones wiped out and ruled over by empires of Christians and Catholics for centuries until just around 100 years ago. This is bigotry, not nuanced both sides of bad thinking." And I reply, "I'm not Catholic. Catholics abused my religion, called us heretics, had us burned at the stake. That doesn't mean that Catholicism didn't serve an important purpose at the time. I think that the problem is that you think in terms of power and oppression. You project that way of thinking onto other people who simply don't share that view. I implore you to be more open-minded and to listen when you repeat back what the other person believes and they say, no." And I really try to see each one of my commenters as an actual human being that is interfaced with potentially hundreds or thousands of people before now, perhaps in person or on social media, and I have no idea who they talked to before me. I have no idea what bad or good influences they've had, and I have no idea what baggage they're bringing to my comment section. So I try to explain everything instead of just kicking them out or making fun of them, because I love torturing myself. And he says here, "So I'll ask you very simply, would it be acceptable today to invade a country you deem barbaric in the name of progress, empire, Christianization, or reclaiming some holy land?" And I replied, without any context, just by itself, of course that's bad. It's like asking if kicking babies is bad. Yes, kicking babies is not acceptable, and abusing that power dynamic is not a good thing. And that's another thing. A lot of people don't see the obvious that's being stated here because we come from completely different moral foundations. When I say something is good, I don't mean, yeah, I'm all for that thing. It just means that in the grand scheme of things, this is the outcome that I preferred, or this is a civilization that I preferred, or they had many things we could have learned from, or many things we did learn from, and overall it was good for society and humanity. Now, I want to leave you one last thing. When I grew up on things like Foxe's Book of Martyrs, which detailed in graphic, horrid, traumatic, vivid imagery how Christians, especially non-Catholic Christians, were either burned at the stake, how their insides turned inside and out, how they're boiled in oil, or how various kings and magistrates had them tortured for hours and days on end. I read about how William Tyndale was burned at the stake by the Catholic Church, and his last words were, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes," before he died. And I know that the Roman Catholic Church has taken many of these instances and simply said, "Oh, these people weren't burned at the stake. They were heretics, and so they're convicted as heretics," and they just kind of whitewash all over. I understand those things. I understand it. But I still say the Catholic Church was a force for good. Not because the Catholic Church was good in everything that it did, but because what the Catholic Church brought to European society and eventually the world was stability that was necessary for advancement and a better, stable society to be born from it. The United States itself is a result of many European ideas, from Greece's philosophies to Roman law and Great Britain's common law. All three of those things are distilled down using a Christian, non-Catholic lens to create the Constitution that we have now, to create what I believe to be the best country that the world has ever seen, in both technological advancement and in moral prowess. And that came about because of those terrible, horrible colonizer countries. I have something to be grateful for, that my great-great-great-great-grandparents, who were probably brought over from Africa as slaves, because thanks to their unfortunate struggle, I am able to live in the best country in the world. I wouldn't want to be born in Africa. I wouldn't want to have a life expectancy of 7 years old to die to some random warlord or some crazy AIDS epidemic. No thank you. I'm happy where I am. So when I say that it's good that I'm here, yes, I recognize that the struggles happened. And there's an implicit understanding among people that share my belief that those struggles happened. But we also recognize that all of humanity has been about people struggling and abusing each other. Probably because they can, probably because nature has been absolutely brutal, and the only real answer to doing so, apart from just striving against nature constantly, is to make someone else do the work for you. So if you're a viewer that looks at things in that fairness mindset, and looks at things as, hey, the big country used its power to oppress the little country. Yes, we see those things. Yes, we acknowledge them. And those things are implicit to our viewpoint. And no, we don't want to just go around oppressing people and enforcing our will on them. But we also don't really see it as useful or efficient to constantly bring it up. It's understood. It's like trying to define all of my words every single time I talk. Why? That's a waste of time. So to circle back to what this originally started with, Aztec Batman, when people make things that redefine history or reimagine history or try to tell it from the perspective of, oh, the brutalized, colonized people, I immediately doubt the creators of such material. Because I feel like instead of from desiring to teach people actual history, they come from a place of nihilism and ungratefulness for the advances that we have now. And I feel like they'd rather look back and sneer in judgment at the people who frankly did the best they could for their time, considering all the other awful options that existed. And yes, I want my sons to know the truth of history. And yes, I want them to be grateful for where we are, where we came from, and I don't want them to think that cultures that practice child sacrifice are good. Sorry, some things are just not worth my respect. But anyway, if you made it this far, thank you for stopping by. Be sure to check out more of my content. I normally talk about a lot of cultural issues. This one in particular, I really felt in my heart needed to have its own video, and I apologize if it was going on too long. But I implore you to go back and watch the original video. It's called Batman Fights White Colonialism as an Aztec Warrior. Or if you like that, even go back and check out the deep dive I did on illegal immigration crisis in the United States, which coincidentally enough only started 100 years ago. But if you really feel the doom and gloom, go check out The Population Collapse, The Truth of America's Failing Birth Rate. But I enjoy this sort of thing. I like trying to convince you, the viewer, of my viewpoints, and, well, I like hearing what you have to say. So, in the comment section, let me know what you think. Whether good or bad, whether you want to tell me how handsome I am or how foolish I sound, just let me know what you actually think. And by all means, please tell me how I can do better. Because in the end, what I really want is to be able to serve you, the viewer. And with that, I'll see you again next time. Bye!